Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we journey into the chilling world of one of Russia's most notorious criminals, Alexander Nikolaevich Spesivtsev, a figure often cited as the Novokuznetsk monster. Over a span of several months in the 1990s, a series of brutal disappearances in the industrial city of Novokuznetsk struck fear into the hearts of residents. Local authorities were at a loss. The missing were primarily young people who vanished without a trace. Neighborhood rumors spread quickly. Families whispered about a sadistic killer, and ominous tales of cannibalism began to seep through the cracks of public silence. Yet the truth would prove even more horrifying than any rumor. Behind closed doors, Spesivtsev, aided in part by his mother, committed crimes so brutal that many seasoned investigators were left deeply shaken. For months, law enforcement struggled to piece together major clues. No obvious links emerged initially, but as the body count slowly surfaced, the darkest story of Novokuznetsk began to take shape. In this documentary-style narrative, we'll examine Alexander Spesivtsev's life, the evolution of his crimes, the harrowing manhunt that ensued, and the psychological forces at play. Brace yourself for a deep dive into a case that, despite its grim nature, underscores the determination of investigators and a community seeking justice. Part 2, The Crime Journey. The setting: Novokuznetsk and its shadows. To grasp the full impact of Alexander Spesivtsev's crimes, one must first understand the climate of Novokuznetsk, a prominent industrial city in southwestern Siberia. Founded in the early 17th century, but more recently developed around coal mining and metallurgy, Novokuznetsk experienced tumultuous times after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Economic instability, unemployment, and a rise in organized crime converged to form a backdrop of social anxiety. By the mid-1990s, factories still belched thick smoke into the winter skies, while entire neighborhoods sank into disrepair as state support dried up. This environment fostered a sense of isolation and despair for many families. Some struggled just to keep food on the table. Others dealt with alcoholism, drug abuse, and mounting domestic conflicts. Law enforcement resources were stretched thin. Local police were swamped with street crime, theft, and violent encounters tied to the black market. Missing persons cases often took a back seat unless there was immediate evidence of foul play. It was in this bleak yet bustling city that Alexander Nikolaevich Spesivtsev lived. Beneath the everyday hustle, something dark was taking root, an unsettling wave of disappearances that primarily involved children or teenagers. Most families assumed their loved ones had fallen prey to the dangers of street life or been lured away by false promises of work. Nothing. Few could have imagined the horrors unfolding behind the walls of a seemingly unremarkable apartment on Pioneersky Prospect, where police would eventually discover evidence linking Spesivtsev to a string of crimes that would stun the nation. Early years of Alexander Spesivtsev. Born in 1970, Alexander was raised in an environment marked by volatility. His father left when he was still young, leaving Alexander and his siblings, if any, under the strict and often suffocating care of his mother, Lumila. Accounts vary regarding the mother's occupation. Some sources say she was a nurse. Others claim she had a background in education. Regardless, her behavior would later raise deep concerns. Many described her as overbearing, manipulative, and emotionally entangled with her son in unhealthy ways. Alexander's childhood was laced with incidents that foreshadowed violence. While official records remain scarce, later psychiatric evaluations suggest he showed early signs of antisocial behavior. Teachers recalled a moody child who had difficulty interacting with peers. Classmates recounted bullying episodes and an unnerving fascination with gore. Yet, in a society grappling with larger structural problems, Alexander's issues did not stand out enough to trigger systemic intervention. During his adolescence, Alexander's deviant behaviors escalated. Small animals disappeared in the neighborhood, prompting whispered suspicions. Still, nothing tied directly back to him, and neighbors or teachers who harbored suspicions often remained silent. Those who dared to confront Lyudmila about her son's actions were met with fierce denials and occasionally threats. By the time Alexander reached his late teens, local whispers cast him as an angry, hostile figure to be avoided whenever possible. Psychological undercurrents and childhood trauma to paint a comprehensive picture of Spesivtsev's psyche. One must explore the possibility of deeper trauma or psychological turmoil. Some criminologists argue that aspects of his upbringing, an absent father figure, an overbearing mother, could have influenced his later violence. Others point out, however, that countless individuals grow up in similarly challenging circumstances without descending into sadistic behavior. What set Alexander apart may have been a disturbing convergence of factors. Early cruelty toward animals often signals a budding lack of empathy. Coupled with possible emotional or psychological abuse, it can create a potent recipe for later, more severe acts. If his mother indeed encouraged or excused his antisocial behaviors, as some witnesses allege, Alexander might have lacked the checks and balances that a supportive community or responsible parenting could provide. By his late teenage years, rumors circulated that Alexander fantasized about extreme violence. He allegedly spent hours locked in his room, immersed in books or media that glorified sadistic acts. Without definitive proof, these allegations remained just rumors, overshadowed by the chaotic tides of the 1980s and early 1990s, when everyday life in Novokuznetsk was precarious and overshadowed by more visible social ills. The road to institutionalization, even if red flags didn't merit wide-scale intervention in Alexander's early life, they eventually led to trouble. In the late 1980s, a violent outburst against a young woman landed Alexander in legal jeopardy. Exact details vary. Some claim he tried to strangle her. Others point to a stabbing incident. Whatever transpired, the courts deemed him mentally unstable. This diagnosis led to his confinement in a psychiatric facility rather than a standard prison term. During his time there, Alexander was subjected to evaluations designed to measure his capacity for empathy, remorse, and social rehabilitation. One psychiatrist's report, later cited in media coverage, described him as devoid of normal emotional responses, harboring intense hostility, and prone to sudden violent impulses. Another evaluation argued that he had borderline intellectual functioning, making him adept at manipulation, but lacking deeper emotional intelligence. After several years of periodic observation and treatment, Alexander was released back into society under conditions that remain murky. Some say his mother pulled strings with local administrators to secure his early discharge. Others claim the facility simply lacked the resources to hold him indefinitely. In either scenario, by the early 1990s, Alexander found himself back in Novokuznetsk, free to roam streets already riddled with hardship. A city in turmoil, socioeconomic crossroads. The 1990s in Russia were a time of massive social upheaval. Organized crime syndicates controlled swaths of commerce. Brutal turf wars sometimes spilled onto public streets, overshadowing less overt forms of violence. Economic desperation drove many to seek quick money through illicit means. Prostitution, drug trafficking, and petty theft soared. For local law enforcement, these conditions meant daily firefights against heavily armed gangs, leaving fewer resources to investigate missing persons or suspicious deaths, especially when the victims were from marginalized backgrounds. In Novokuznetsk, the situation was no different. Unemployment soared, welfare systems lagged, and entire families struggled to get by. As a result, street children, orphaned, abandoned, or otherwise vulnerable, became a common sight around railway stations and industrial outskirts. They begged, scavenged, and sometimes vanished without anyone filing a report. This grim environment provided perfect camouflage for a predator like Alexander Spesivtsev. Teenage runaways or children from broken homes were often dismissed as transients who might have left the city. By the time anyone noticed a pattern, the unthinkable had already been happening behind closed doors. Emergence of the monster. Suspected early murders. While it's difficult to pinpoint the exact moment Alexander Spesivtsev first crossed the threshold from violent fantasist to murder, investigators later pieced together a series of suspicious incidents. Several teenage girls disappeared around the city center, with no bodies recovered. Families filed missing persons reports, but police investigations hit dead ends. No one suspected a solitary figure orchestrating these vanishings. Interestingly, some early sightings placed a young man near the last known locations of these victims, someone matching Alexander's general height and build. These accounts were too vague to form a reliable suspect profile, and few witnesses came forward, perhaps out of fear or resignation. Meanwhile, rumors about an odd duo, a mother and son, sometimes drifted through local gossip, but no one had concrete evidence of wrongdoing. It wasn't until a few months later, when fragments of clothing and personal belongings were found in a vacant lot near Alexander's neighborhood, that police began to suspect a connection. Even then, the city's pressing crime rate meant investigators could only devote limited manpower to the case. Disappearances seemed almost commonplace. Many families lacked the means or the influence to press for deeper inquiries. Consequently, the early stage of Alexander's killing spree remains shrouded in uncertainty. What does seem certain is that the seeds of terror had already been planted. The Pioneersky Prospect apartment. A house of horrors. One cannot fully comprehend Alexander Spesivtsev's crimes without focusing on the modest apartment he shared with his mother on Pioneersky Prospect. Externally, it looked like any other Soviet-era flat, a drab, rectangular building with peeling paint and a communal entryway. Neighbors occasionally complained of strange noises, full odors, and random comings and goings at odd hours. Most chalked it up to the apartment's occupant being reclusive or unfriendly. In reality, the unit served as a makeshift prison, torture chamber, and, according to some reports, site of cannibalistic acts. The precise timeline of events inside remains murky, with multiple conflicting testimonies and limited forensic evidence. Nothing. What is clear is that Alexander lured or forcibly brought victims, often young girls, into his lair. Bound by fear and violence, they found themselves trapped in an environment of unimaginable cruelty. Lyudmila, Alexander's mother, emerges as a deeply sinister figure in this chapter. Some witnesses claim she assisted in selecting victims by luring them with promises of food or shelter, particularly targeting vulnerable runaways. Others suggest she helped dispose of incriminating evidence. The extent of her participation remains a point of debate. No, though it's widely accepted that she enabled Alexander's atrocities, either through direct complicity or willful blindness. The community reacts, whispers and warnings. As the disappearances continued, Novokuznetsk residents began to sense that something more sinister than mere street crime was at play. Parents cautioned their children to stay away from strangers, especially near the district where the Spesivtsev apartment was located. Whispered rumors described a man-eater, or house of horrors. Some even cited vague anecdotes about a young man who had been institutionalized and now roamed free. Still, few people imagined the true extent of the brutality. The social stigma attached to mental illness, combined with local skepticism about police competency, contributed to a climate where accusations did not easily translate into formal investigations. Those who tried to raise alarms about Alexander, pointing to his aggressive demeanor, His mother's odd behavior, or odd happenings in the building, often found themselves dismissed as gossips or troublemakers. Meanwhile, Alexander seemed to sense that suspicion was growing. He reportedly became more cautious, more selective in choosing victims who were far less likely to be missed street children, runaways, and those estranged from their families. This strategy allowed him to operate under the radar for an extended period, compounding the frustration of investigators who struggled to find consistent leads or cooperation from potential witnesses. The breaking point discovery of evidence, a pivotal moment arrived when neighbors complained to authorities about a horrific odor emanating from the Spesivtsev apartment. This wasn't the first time complaints had been lodged, but prior visits by local patrol officers yielded little. Either Lyudmila turned them away under plausible pretexts, or they simply did not investigate thoroughly. However, this time, a determined junior officer named Sergei Vasilyev led the call. He'd read multiple missing persons reports and found links to the same general area. Alarmed by the building's persistent complaints, he convinced his superiors to authorize a proper search. Nothing. Armed with a warrant, they knocked on the Spesivtsev door. When no one answered, they forced their way in. The scenes they discovered inside would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Reports vary on the exact condition of the apartment. Some mention horrifying sights that defied belief. Human remains in various stages of decay, makeshift restraints, and personal belongings of reported missing individuals. Photographs from the scene, locked away in police archives, reportedly left even seasoned forensic investigators traumatized. This undeniable evidence shattered the final vestiges of public naivety. A real monster had been living among them, enabled by a combination of fear, bureaucratic failings, and the city's chaotic social conditions. The failed arrest and flight. As the search team spread out through the apartment, they quickly realized that Alexander was nowhere to be found. They did find a teenage girl who was still alive, albeit gravely injured. This survivor provided crucial insights into the horrors that had taken place, though her testimony would take time to formalize. Meanwhile, a frantic manhunt ensued. Lyudmila was arrested on sight, screaming accusations at the officers, insisting that her son was blameless. She claimed they were persecuting him unfairly, that any remains found were due to an elaborate frame-up. Authorities dismissed her rants as either delusional or a desperate attempt at covering up the truth. She was placed under secure detention, and intense interrogations began. News of Alexander's escape spread rapidly, fueling panic throughout Novokuznetsk. Families barricaded their homes, and sightings poured in from across the region. Some obviously false, others more credible. For several days, the city felt on edge, uncertain when or where this dangerous individual might resurface. Police, ill-equipped for a large-scale manhunt, called in additional help from regional branches. The stage was set for a dramatic pursuit that would bring the entire story of Alexander Spesivtsev's atrocities to a harrowing climax. Part 3. The process of capturing the criminal, immediate aftermath, panic, and determination. In the wake of the gruesome discovery at the apartment, the initial wave of shock galvanized local law enforcement and frightened citizens alike. No one doubted the gravity of the crimes anymore. Investigators scrambled to identify the remains found in the flat, combing through missing persons for reports for any clue that might match the personal items and fragments left behind. New details emerged from the survivor's statements. Though severely traumatized, she managed to describe how she was abducted, the layout of the apartment, and hints about Alexander's last known whereabouts before he fled. These bits of intelligence provided vital leads on possible safe houses or escape routes he might use. Meanwhile, local media outlets fanned the flames of public fear, with some tabloids labeling Spesivtsev as a Siberian monster, or Butcher of Novokuznetsk. Realizing they were dealing with a highly violent, cunning individual, local authorities reached out to the Ministry of Internal Affairs for reinforcements. The case drew national attention, prompting the deployment of specialized units trained in manhunts and forensic analysis. Setting aside jurisdictional turf wars, investigators worked around the clock, combing abandoned buildings, bus stations, and the dense forests on the outskirts of the city, piecing together the larger picture. Before launching a full-scale dragnet, investigators needed a clearer sense of Alexander Spesivtsev's history and network. They dove into hospital records, psychiatric evaluations, prior police reports, and any statement from neighbors who recalled earlier suspicious incidents. This deep dive confirmed many of the rumors. He had spent time in a psychiatric institution after a violent assault, only to be released under questionable circumstances. He'd been living with his mother, Lyudmila, in that same apartment for years, nothing, during which an alarming number of children and teenagers went missing in the surrounding neighborhoods. Central to the investigation was uncovering how Alexander managed to lure so many victims into his home. Some theorized he preyed upon homeless youths offering food, a warm place to sleep, or false promises of work. Others believed Lyudmila played a significant role, using her matronly appearance to disarm potential victims. The truth likely included both methods, with mother and son capitalizing on the desperate vulnerability of street children and runaways. The role of Lyudmila in interrogation. While Alexander roamed free, police pinned hopes on extracting vital information from his mother. Lyudmila's interrogations became a focal point of the investigation. Initially, she hurled accusations at the authorities, claiming conspiracies and sabotage. She portrayed Alexander as a misunderstood victim of society's prejudices. Over time, however, her defensive stance cracked. Investigators threatened her with severe legal repercussions, including charges of aiding and abetting murder and concealing evidence. Faced with the possibility of life behind bars or worse, Lyudmila began offering bits of information, though it was always difficult to separate truth from her manipulative lies. She hinted that Alexander might seek refuge in certain remote areas or with acquaintances from his earlier years. Inconsistent as her testimony was, it at least provided potential leads. Experts analyzing her statements concluded she was deeply complicit, possibly even playing an active role in some of the abductions. Nonetheless, the priority remained capturing Alexander. Nothing deemed the prime orchestrator of the atrocities. Over time, Lyudmila's interrogation notes became part of a labyrinthine puzzle that combined witness accounts, forensic discoveries, and intelligence from local informants, establishing a citywide and regional dragnet. With rumors swirling and fear peaking, authorities launched a large-scale manhunt. Nothing? Police set up checkpoints on major roads leading out of Novokuznetsk, scrutinizing vehicles and passenger documents. Train stations and bus terminals were monitored more closely than ever, with plainclothes officers circulating among travelers, posters displaying Alexander's face, along with a stark warning about his dangerous nature, plastered the city walls. Despite these efforts, sightings poured in from all corners, some credible, many not. Investigators found themselves chasing shadows. A tip would claim that a man matching Alexander's description was spotted loitering near a school, prompting a flurry of response units, only to find no sign of him. Another call reported him hitchhiking on a highway out of town, resulting in fruitless hours of searching. The city was on edge, but so was Alexander. He had every reason to fear capture, knowing the gruesome evidence stacked against him. During these tense days, local media walked a fine line between informing the public and fueling panic. Some outlets provided daily updates on police progress, describing areas under search, or urging residents to stay vigilant. Others sensationalized rumors, nothing, speculating on satanic rituals or mass conspiracies. This heightened climate made it both easier and more difficult for authorities. Citizens reported anything remotely suspicious, but the sheer volume of false leads threatened to overwhelm the task force. Forensic breakthroughs simultaneously. Forensic teams were working around the clock to process the horrifying scene in Spesivtsev's apartment. Clothing, personal mementos, DNA samples, and trace evidence were meticulously cataloged. Nothing. Although decomposing remains made identification challenging, advanced analysis and comparisons to missing persons files offered hope. One crucial discovery was a notebook allegedly containing scribbled notes that investigators interpreted as a kind of diary of events. While some entries were incoherent or cryptic, others mentioned first names or initials corresponding to missing children. This shocking document served as partial proof that the nightmare in the apartment had been methodical rather than random. It also hinted that Alexander might have chosen his victims carefully, contradicting the assumption that he simply picked them by chance from the streets. These forensic breakthroughs had an additional effect. They galvanized the community's determination to see justice served. Families whose loved ones remained unaccounted for began cooperating more fully with the police. Local advocacy groups formed to share information and to support each other in grief and uncertainty. If any positive emerged from this tragedy, it was the unity forged by the city's collective resolve to stop a predator in their midst. Tensions within the task force, despite the unified front shown to the public, internal tensions simmered within the investigative task force. Local officers bristled at what they perceived as condescension from higher-ups brought in from major cities. Meanwhile, federal operatives chafed at the disorganized local records and the lack of clear protocols. With the clock ticking and the city's population in near hysteria, stress levels soared. Command decisions sometimes led to friction. Should they saturate the city center with uniformed patrols or rely more on plainclothes officers? Nothing. Was it better to keep a tight net around Novokuznetsk or expand the search to neighboring regions and the Trans-Siberian rail lines? Debates erupted over resource allocation, with each team convinced its approach was the most effective. In the end, a compromise emerged, a tiered strategy where Novokuznetsk remained the epicenter of a concentrated force, while traveling squads branched into outlying areas, working alongside local authorities in each town. This flexible approach allowed them to cover more ground without stripping the city of essential manpower. As days turned to weeks, the sense of urgency deepened. Everyone knew that if Alexander remained free, new victims might vanish. The surprise tip in rural hideouts, while official channels grappled with procedure and strategy. The key break in the case came from an unexpected quarter. A reclusive farmer living on the outskirts of Novokuznetsk contacted police with information about a disheveled man who had trespassed on his property, stealing food scraps and sleeping in a dilapidated barn. The farmer only recognized the man as the wanted fugitive after seeing a news report the following day. Alarmed, nothing. He relayed a detailed account of what he had observed, including the man's approximate build, the clothes he wore, and the direction he fled. Investigators swiftly acted on this tip. Teams fanned out into the rural zones, setting up discreet observation points near likely hiding places, abandoned cabins, old barns, thickly wooded areas known to be frequented by drifters. The region's challenging terrain, a mix of dense forest, rugged hills, and unpredictable weather, complicated the search. Still, the farmer's tip was the most concrete lead they had received in weeks. Local hunters were also enlisted. Many knew the terrain intimately and could navigate thick undergrowth more efficiently than outsiders. These civilian volunteers, armed with hunting rifles and a grim sense of purpose, formed an informal ring around the perimeter to prevent the fugitive from slipping through unseen. The alliance between law enforcement and civilians underscored the collective desperation to capture a man who represented a profound threat to public safety. Narrowing the noose, the final hours, as the second week of the manhunt approached, the net tightened around an area of forest near a small settlement about 40 kilometers outside Novokonets. Multiple sightings suggested a man matching Alexander's description lurked there, possibly subsisting on stolen food and sleeping rough. By day, he remained out of sight among thick pines. At night, he crept toward farmsteads or remote roads, scavenging what he could. Police set up a series of concealed observation points around likely access routes, rotating shifts to ensure 24-hour coverage. Tension ran high, fatigue and the sheer scale of the terrain tested the team's endurance. Late one night, a group of officers spotted movement near a shallow creek. Using night vision equipment, they identified a single male figure crouching by the water. They called for backup, careful not to spook him. A dramatic foot chase ensued, warned over radio that the suspect was heading westward. Other teams raced to intercept. In the darkness of the Siberian countryside, with only moonlight illuminating their path, officers scrambled over uneven ground and through dense underbrush. An officer eventually tackled the fleeing figure, leading to a brief, frenzied struggle. But the suspect's strength was no match for the collective force of armed professionals. They subdued him, confirmed his identity, and radioed the triumphant news back to headquarters. Alexander Spesivtsev was finally in custody. The aftermath of capture. The city's initial response to Alexander's capture was a mixture of immense relief and profound anger. Some residents believed he should be executed without trial, reflecting the raw pain that many families felt. Investigators, however, needed him alive to ensure a thorough legal process and to glean information that might shed light on other victims. Nothing. Authorities transported Alexander back to Novokuznetsk under heavy guard. Crowds gathered outside the detention facility, chanting for justice. It fell to the courts, prosecutors, and psychiatric evaluators to sift through evidence of crimes so unspeakable that many in law enforcement admitted they had never seen anything like it. Inside interrogation rooms, a new phase of the process began. The slow, agonizing unraveling of how Alexander orchestrated so many murders and the extent of his mother's involvement. Part 4 Tree. Psychological analysis. The anatomy of a monster. When facing a case as disturbing as Alexander Spesivtsev's, it's tempting to label him as an inexplicable monster. Yet, forensic psychologists argue that to dismiss him as Mirville incarnate risks overlooking the complexities that shaped his behavior. A central question emerges. How does an individual arrive at such a point of depravity? In Alexander's situation, a combination of nature and nurture seems evident. Psychopathic or antisocial personality traits likely had a biological component, manifesting early in his life as cruelty toward animals and disregard for social norms. But the environment played a pivotal role too. His mother's alleged complicity and the absence of paternal guidance could have fostered a warped worldview in which empathy was non-existent. Institutional failures, including shortfalls in mental health care and the social safety net, provided a breeding ground for his escalation from violent fantasies to actual homicide. The mother-son dynamic. One of the most debated aspects of Spesivtsev's case is the role of his mother, Lyudmila. Rather than discouraging her son's brutality, many experts believe she actively facilitated it. Why would a parent support such heinous acts? Some hypothesize that Lyudmila developed a pathological attachment to Alexander. Nothing. Derived from an obsessive need to control or shelter him from a world she perceived as hostile. Others suspect she herself might have held sadistic tendencies. A smaller contingent of observers posits that she was as much a victim of her son's violence, acting under duress or suffering from delusions. However, the weight of evidence, including testimony from survivors and the items discovered in her home, strongly suggest complicity. Psychologically, their bond may have functioned as a twisted symbiosis, where each enabled the other's descent into cruelty. She provided a veneer of domestic normalcy, deflecting suspicion by handling everyday errands and social transactions. He indulged in unspeakable acts, shielded by a mother who refused to question his behavior. The synergy between them arguably pushed Alexander's violence to levels he might not have reached on his own. Cannibalism and the quest for total domination. A few details in Spesivtsev's case are as stomach-churning as the allegations of cannibalism. Although specific evidence and confessions are shrouded in partial secrecy and disputed by some official sources, multiple investigators and journalists assert that remains found in the apartment bore signs of butchery. Testimony from rescued victims, including the teenage girl discovered alive, also hinted at episodes of forced cannibalism. What drives an individual to commit such a taboo? Criminologists suggest that cannibalistic acts in serial killers often represent an ultimate form of domination, consuming the victim's flesh as a twisted means of possessing them entirely. It may also be fueled by a sense of ritual or a deeper psychological pathology that conflates violence, sexuality, and appetite. In a rarer subset of cases, practical considerations, like disposing of evidence, might play a role, though that doesn't wholly account for the level of sadism described here. Whether the cannibalism was an ongoing practice or sporadic experimentation remains uncertain. Regardless, the mere suggestion of it catapulted the Spesivtsev case into a realm of infamy, further fueling public outrage and media sensationalism. Even seasoned forensic psychiatrists found themselves grappling with the depth of depravity implied by such acts. Prayer institutionalization, a missed opportunity. Spesivtsev's early confinement in a psychiatric facility raises pressing questions about the efficacy of mental health interventions in Russia's turbulent 1990s. Could more rigorous oversight have prevented his future crimes? Did doctors simply lack the resources to provide consistent treatment or track patients after discharge? In many post-Soviet regions at the time, psychiatric institutions were understaffed and underfunded. Patients often cycled in and out, receiving minimal therapy and sporadic medication. Discharge protocols could be arbitrary, influenced by bureaucratic demands or personal connections. Rumors even suggested bribery might hasten release. Under these conditions, an individual harboring severe antisocial tendencies could easily slip through the cracks. Forensic experts examining the case postulate that Alexander's mental state warranted prolonged, specialized care. Instead, he was granted an early release, returning to a city ill, prepared to monitor him. Nothing. This systemic failure underscores how fragile societal safeguards can become when economic instability overwhelms social services. It also exemplifies how a single administrative decision can have devastating long-term consequences. Vulnerability of street children and systemic neglect. A key aspect of Spesivtsev's spree was his choice of victims, predominantly juveniles or teenagers lacking stable family backgrounds. Sociologists highlight how the sweeping poverty and social dislocation of 1990s Russia produced a generation of at-risk youth. Many lived in orphanages that were overcrowded and underfunded, left them upon turning a certain age, and ended up on the streets. These children represented the perfect victims for a predator. They were less likely to be reported missing promptly. Sometimes they had no caring relatives at all. Law enforcement's efforts were hampered by the sheer volume of homeless youth. Tracing a runaway's path, or differentiating between a child who had simply left the city and one who had fallen prey to violence, often proved nearly impossible. From a psychological standpoint, Alexander's predation on this demographic implies a deliberate exploitation of society's weakest. It highlights the role of environment in enabling serial killers. Had these children enjoyed robust social services or stable family support, they might never have crossed paths with a man who viewed them as expendable objects for his brutal impulses. The desire for control beyond the stark brutality, a recurring theme in Alexander's behavior, appears to be control. Whether through kidnapping, psychological manipulation, or physical torment, he imposed his will absolutely on his victims. Survivors described him as eerily calm during acts of torture, as though methodically orchestrating every detail to fulfill a personal script. Control also manifested in how he managed the secrecy of his crimes. He meticulously cleaned parts of the apartment, threatened neighbors with vague warnings, nothing, and cultivated an image that made people hesitant to challenge him or his mother. Such controlling behaviors are often rooted in deep insecurity or a desire to compensate for earlier feelings of powerlessness. In Alexander's case, any early sense of vulnerability due to paternal abandonment, psychiatric confinement, or social ostracism may have crystallized into a pathological need to dominate others completely. Lacking remorse or moral understanding, finally, one of the most chilling revelations about Alexander came from the limited interactions investigators had with him after his capture. Multiple psychiatric assessments concluded that he displayed minimal empathy or remorse. Instead, he rationalized his actions by blaming the victims, society, or circumstances. This outward indifference, combined with glimpses of sadistic pleasure, placed him among the rarest subset of offenders whose conscience seems profoundly impaired. When questioned directly about the gruesome details found in his apartment, Alexander often responded with detached interest or evasive, almost childlike deflections. Such responses further underscore the depth of his moral disconnection. Whether due to inherent psychopathy, environmental factors, or a combination of both, his psyche appeared sealed off from the normal emotional and ethical responses that deter most people from extreme violence. Part 5. The end. The case of Alexander Nikolaevich Spesivtsev stands as a dark testament to the terrifying extremes of human cruelty. In the industrial sprawl of Novokuznetsk, amid social upheaval and weakened institutions, he preyed on the city's most vulnerable. Street children and teens with nowhere else to turn. Together with his mother, he fashioned an apartment into a hidden realm of brutality, leaving deep scars not only on his unfortunate victims, but also on a city struggling to rebuild its identity in post-Soviet Russia. If there is any glimmer of resolution, it lies in the tenacity of dedicated officers and the communal outrage that ultimately drove the manhunt. The discovery of his House of Horrors shattered any illusions that such monstrosities could not happen within ordinary neighborhoods. Through determination, forensic innovation, and the courage of those who dared to speak up, whether a tenacious junior officer or a traumatized survivor, he was finally brought to justice. Today, Alexander Spesivtsev remains a subject of both revulsion and grim fascination. His crimes underscore systemic failure as overburdened law enforcement, fragile mental health services, and the societal neglect of at-risk youth. They also underline the uncomfortable reality that predators often exploit cracks in the social fabric. Though justice has, in a sense, been served, the wounds left by his actions still etch in Novokuznetsk's collective memory. We hope this account, as harrowing as it is, nothing, serves as a reminder that vigilance and compassion can be potent safeguards against those who would do harm. Nothing. If you found this exploration of the Spesivtsev case compelling, or wish to discuss the broader issues around criminal psychology and systemic vulnerabilities, please share your thoughts. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more in-depth analysis of real life cases that reveal the darkest edges of human nature and the resilience that rises to meet it. Stay aware, stay informed, and remember, communities that look after their most vulnerable often stand the strongest against evil lurking in the shadows.